The horsemen appear first as rumors. A caravan arrives with fewer men than it left with. A refugee stumbles through a city gate half mad, with dust in his mouth. A governor hears that one frontier town is gone, then another, then a third, and still no one can say exactly how many enemies are coming. Only that they move too fast, only that they are already somewhere else by the time the message is written. Then the horizon darkens, not with a solid wall of bodies, but with fragments, riders spreading wide across the plain, vanishing in dust, reappearing at the flank, at the rear, at the river crossing you thought was safe. This is how empires begin to die, not when their walls are breached, but when their certainties are. By the early 13th century, the name that carries this fear across Eurasia is Genghis Khan. To some, he is a scourge. To others, a lawgiver. To many, especially those looking back from the ruins, he seems almost superhuman, the master of an empire that cannot be stopped, an army that cannot be caught, a force that seems to obey no natural limit. But, if Genghis Khan's empire was truly invincible, why did it need such ruthless discipline? Why did it depend so completely on speed, pasture, intelligence, and terror? And why, after seeming to overwhelm the world, did it fracture with such astonishing speed? The truth is more unsettling than the legend. The Mongol Empire did not conquer because it was magical, or because its enemies were weak in every way, or because history simply decided to kneel. It was conquered because one man and the system he forged turned the brutal logic of the steppe into the most efficient engine of war the medieval world had ever seen. And like every engine, it had conditions, it had fuel, it had points of failure. This is the story of Genghis Khan's invincible empire, and the hard truth hiding inside the myth. To understand that truth, you have to leave the marble courts and city walls behind. You have to ride east, into a world of wind and distance so vast it can feel almost abstract on a map, but in life it is intimate and merciless. The Mongolian steppe is not empty. It is disciplined by the weather. It is governed by hunger. It teaches movement, memory, and vigilance. A boy learns direction from stars, survival from animals, politics from blood feud. A tribe lives or dies by horses, kinship, alliances, and the ability to strike first when negotiation fails. From the perspective of the great settled civilizations around it, northern China, the Islamic cities of Central Asia, the principalities of the Rus, the steppe often appears as a frontier of raiders. But this view misses the deeper truth. The steppe is not outside history. It is a different school of history. It produces societies built for mobility, societies in which every adult male is already part rider, part hunter, part soldier, and where leadership cannot rely entirely on inherited splendor. A weak chief can be abandoned, a foolish one can be killed. Prestige matters, lineage matters, but so does competence, so do nerves. By the late 12th century, the wider world surrounding the steppe was rich, divided, and strained. Northern China is not one unified empire, but a fractured arena of rival states. Central Asia is prosperous, but politically brittle. Routes of trade cross deserts, mountains, and oasis cities, carrying silk, silver, grain, horses, beliefs, and disease. Wealth accumulates behind walls. Rival dynasties distrust one another. Great powers spend strength in regional struggle. From a steppe war leader's point of view, this is not a sealed world. It is a world full of seams, and out on those grasslands, amid clan feuds and shifting loyalties, a child is born who will learn earlier than most that protection is fragile. He was born in Temujin, probably around 1162, into the Borjigin lineage. His father, Yesuge, is a chieftain of standing. His mother, Hoilun, has already lived the violence of the steppe, taken in marriage after abduction, carried into another family's fate. Temujin's childhood does not begin in safety and end in hardship. It begins under a hard sky and quickly becomes harder. When he is still young, his father is poisoned by Tatars. The clan that should protect the widow and her children abandons them. The family is cast out into hunger. This is one of the most important truths about Genghis Khan, and one the legend often flattens. He does not come to power from ease. He is shaped by precarity, by roots pulled from frozen ground, by fish caught in thin water, by the knowledge that prestige without armed loyalty is air. In some versions of the story, this period becomes almost mythic. The future conqueror as a starved outcast, the abandoned boy who hardens into iron. But beneath the legend is a political education more powerful than romance. Temujin learns that kin can fail, that alliance is more reliable when it is reinforced by interest, that sentiment without force is nothing. His rise is neither smooth nor inevitable. It is jagged, dangerous, and full of reversals. He forms relationships that matter, then loses them. He wins support, then provokes fear. His wife, Borte, is kidnapped. Recovering her requires coalition building and proof that he can command aid. He draws on old ties with Togril of the Kerait and on the support of his boyhood companion, Jamukha, who will later become one of his most important rivals. This is steppe politics at close range, friendship turning into competition, loyalty turning into fracture, every bond under pressure from ambition. What makes Temujin different is not simply courage. The steppe is full of courageous men. It is not simple brutality either. There is no shortage of that. What makes him exceptional is his ability to convert personal struggle into institutional design. He begins to build something larger than a clan confederation. He rewards service. He promotes ability. He breaks old aristocratic assumptions when they obstruct effectiveness. He reorganizes the human material of the steppe for war, not for one campaign, but perpetually. That transformation matters as much as any battle. The Mongol military under Genghis Khan is not a chaotic horde. That word survives because terrified enemies use it, and because later imagination prefers barbaric mystery to disciplined explanation. In reality, the Mongol war machine is tightly ordered. Units are organized on a decimal basis. Command structure is clear. Discipline is severe. Disobedience can mean death. Booty is distributed through rules, not merely looted in frenzy. Commanders are advanced for ability, not just noble birth. Loyal conquered peoples, especially Turkic groups, are absorbed and used effectively. Intelligence is gathered before campaigns begin. Scouts and spies move ahead of armies. Psychological pressure starts long before arrows do. This is the first great secret inside the idea of Mongol invincibility. They do not rely on raw momentum alone. They manufacture advantages. A Mongol army can seem larger than it is because it moves with astonishing speed, because it converges at the decisive point, because it understands when not to fight. Its horses are small, tough, and enduring. Riders use remounts. Communication systems and messenger relays allow information to travel across immense distances. Feigned retreats lure enemies out of position. Dust clouds mask movement. Flanking maneuvers swallow armies that think they are still fighting to the front. Terror becomes a weapon in itself. A city that resists may be annihilated so that others surrender without testing the matter. This is not invulnerability. It is an operational genius, reinforced by methodical cruelty. By 1206, after years of conflict, Temujin had achieved what generations of steppe leaders could not. At a great assembly, he is proclaimed Genghis Khan. The title is often rendered as universal ruler, though its full meaning remains debated. The debate matters less than the reality. A man who once lived on scraps has united the Mongol tribes and created the foundation of a new state. Not a settled empire yet, not a bureaucratic civilization in the classic sense, but something rarer, a mobile power disciplined enough to devour sedentary worlds. At first, the campaigns expand outward in rings, into northern China against the Jin, against the Tangut kingdom of Shi Shah, against rival peoples who stand between the steppe heartland and richer targets beyond. Each victory teaches the Mongols something. They do not remain fixed in old methods. They learn siegecraft, they absorb engineers, they adapt technologies from conquered populations. The stereotyped image of Mongol warfare as nothing but horse archery on open ground misses the frightening flexibility of the system. Genghis Khan's empire learns as it kills, and what spreads with the armies is not only fear, but reputation. The name alone begins to act on battlefields before the men arrive. Rulers hear of cities that refused submission and ceased to exist. Merchants hear of roads made safer under Mongol order, in one region even as other regions burn. Enemies see contradiction and cannot quite interpret it. How can a conqueror be both destroyer and organizer? How can the same force massacre resistors, then restore trade, protect envoys, and incorporate artisans? But this was only the beginning. The real proving ground of Mongol power would come not on the grasslands, but in the wealthy, urban, interconnected world of Central Asia. There, the Khwarezmian Empire stretches from the borders of India toward Anatolia, a formidable realm under Muhammad II. On paper, this is the sort of state that should not simply disappear. It possesses cities, manpower, tax base, and prestige. If the Mongols are merely raiders from the steppe, this is where the myth should collapse. Instead, this is where it explodes. The breach begins, as history sometimes does, with arrogance and mistrust. Genghis Khan sends a trade caravan westward. At Otrar, the governor seizes the merchants, suspecting espionage, and the men are killed. Genghis responds not immediately with full annihilation, but with envoys demanding redress. Those envoys are humiliated and murdered. It is one of the great catastrophes of political miscalculation. A border incident becomes a civilizational death sentence. When the Mongol invasion came in 1219, it did not arrive as a blunt charge against a single gate. It arrives as a problem the Khwarezmian state cannot solve because it cannot locate the center of the threat quickly enough. Genghis Khan divides forces. Columns move across impossible ground. Cities that expect time to prepare discover that time has already been taken from them. The invaders bypass strongpoints, sever communications, and exploit confusion. The Shah struggles to concentrate resistance. His empire, like many before it, turns out to be larger on parchment than in practice. Bukhara falls. Samarkand falls. One city after another discovers that walls alone are no answer to an enemy that combines mobility with siege capability and political warfare with military pressure. The Mongols do not simply batter themselves against fortification until stone breaks. They isolate, intimidate, infiltrate, recruit, deceive, and then destroy. Garrison morale collapses. Local divisions matter. The illusion of imperial coherence vanishes under stress. If you're enjoying this kind of deep history told at full scale, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which empire we should put under the same merciless lens next. Because the story only gets darker from here. The campaign against Khwarezm became the centerpiece of Genghis Khan's legend for a reason. It is not just a conquest, it is a demonstration that no ruler from China to the Islamic world can safely assume that distance will protect him. The Shah flees westward, pursued by Mongol generals whose names will become dreaded in their own right, Jabi and Subutai among them. The pursuit is relentless, the geography expands, the war spills outward like fire finding dry grass, and still, the myth of invincibility grows. But here is what that myth hides. The Mongols are not winning because they are physically superior in every individual contest. Often, they are outnumbered. Often their enemies are larger men, equipped for heavy combat, fighting from cities of immense wealth. The Mongols win because they turn war into a system of tempo. They decide where the battle happens, when it happens, and increasingly, whether the enemy even has a coherent battlefield left to stand on. They cultivate the impression of being everywhere because they can move farther and faster than most opponents believe possible. They do not smash blindly into strength if they can fracture it first. This difference between seeming invincible and being exquisitely efficient is the difference between legend and truth. Still, for the people inside the path of conquest, that distinction is cold comfort. Conquest under Genghis Khan is not a bloodless masterpiece of operational art. It is devastation on a continental scale. Populations are uprooted, irrigation systems are damaged, skilled workers are deported. Cities that resist can be slaughtered. The surviving stories are full of smoke, panic, forced marches, executions, and the deliberate spreading of fear. The empire's brilliance cannot be separated from its capacity for terror. In fact, terror is part of the brilliance. That is the moral wound at the center of the Mongol achievement. And yet conquest is not the whole story. Even during Genghis Khan's lifetime, the emerging empire reveals another face. Once territory is subdued, routes can become safer than before. Messengers move through relay stations. Administrators are retained from conquered societies to keep daily governance functioning. Clerics of different religions may receive exemptions or favor, not because the Mongols are modern liberals, but because pragmatic tolerance serves rule better than forced conversion. They are shamanist in origin, but not driven to impose uniform belief across an enormous and varied dominion. They recognize utility when they see it. What nobody realizes at first is that this capacity for accommodation will become almost as historically consequential as the conquests themselves. Under Genghis Khan, and even more under his successors, the Mongol world begins linking distant regions with unusual intensity. China, Iran, Central Asia, and the Western steppe are drawn into a single political arc. Artisans, merchants, diplomats, scholars, captives, and technologies travel further and faster. Luxury goods move, but so do techniques, styles, scientific ideas, and administrative practices. Later generations will call this the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. And while that phrase can sound too serene for such a violent empire, it points to something real. A force that shatters old orders also knits together an immense transcontinental space. This is the contradiction that makes the Mongol Empire so difficult to fit into moral simplicity. It is both destroyer and connector. It leaves charred cities and widened horizons. It turns massacre into policy and exchange into infrastructure. It is one of history's most savage engines of integration. Still, every empire carries the shape of its own weakness inside its strength. For the Mongols, that weakness is already present in the very logic of their success. Their armies depend on horses, on grazing land, on mobility, on a leadership structure capable of coordinating dispersed forces. Their political order depends heavily on the authority of the ruling house and on the personal legitimacy Genghis Khan has built through charisma, conquest, and distribution of reward. Their empire is vast, but vastness is not the same as permanence. A machine can be unmatched and still be fragile if too many of its parts must work at once. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during the campaign against Xia. The exact circumstances remain uncertain. By then, however, uncertainty about the man matters less than certainty about the system. He has created a war state capable of outliving him, and for a time, it does. Under his sons and grandsons, Mongol expansion continues. The empire reaches farther still. Parts of Russia fall under Mongol domination. Armies penetrate deep into Europe. Hungary is shattered at Mohi. Poland reels after Legnica. Baghdad will later fall to Hulagu, grandson of Genghis, in a blow so symbolic it seems to split an era in two. At its greatest extent, the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in history. If you stand inside that century and look outward, it can truly seem that nothing can resist it for long. And this is exactly why the truth about its limits matters. Take Europe in 1241 and 1242. The Mongols have already demonstrated battlefield superiority against major forces. Their generals are brilliant, their enemies are reeling. Then, suddenly, the advance halts. In later memory, this moment becomes an irresistible canvas for fantasy. Some want to believe Europe was saved by providence. Others insist the Mongols could have conquered the entire continent if they chose. The reality is more complex and much more revealing. The death of the great Khan Ogedei likely mattered. Senior princes and commanders were pulled back into the politics of succession. But that is not the only factor. Weather and grazing conditions mattered. An army built on horse mobility cannot function without pasture. Casualties, too, were more serious than older legends like to admit. Distance stretches logistics. Political priorities shift. An empire that seems unstoppable on campaign reveals the constraints beneath the momentum. In other words, the Mongols did not stop because they ceased to be formidable. They stopped because even the most formidable cavalry empire in history remains tied to the environment, institutions, and internal politics. The real turning point in how we understand Mongol invincibility lies here. Invincibility is a story told by people who mistake a period of overwhelming advantage for a permanent law of history. But no such law exists. Not for Rome, not for Napoleon, not for the British Empire, not for the Mongols. What Genghis Khan built was not an empire outside material reality. It was an empire that mastered material reality better than its rivals, until the scale of its own success multiplied the pressures it had to survive. Those pressures grow after the first great wave of conquest. The descendants of Genghis Khan inherit not just triumph, but geography. Immense, unwieldy geography. Different fronts, different economic zones, different political cultures, different visions of rule. The center cannot hold everything with equal force forever. The empire begins to differentiate into major khanates: the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Iran, the Chagatai realm in Central Asia, the Golden Horde across the western steppe and into Eastern Europe. These branches remain connected by lineage and memory, but they are not one seamless body in practice. And yet fragmentation should not be mistaken for immediate collapse. Even divided, the Mongol world continues to shape Eurasia profoundly. Relay systems carry messages over thousands of miles. Passports and safe conduct devices facilitate movement. Artisans are transplanted. Court culture changes. Techniques and motifs cross from East Asia into Islamic lands and back again. Trade routes become arteries not only of profit, but of encounter. Marco Polo's world is unimaginable without Mongol unification. So is much of the later circulation of ideas, goods, and diseases that alter the late medieval world. Yes, diseases as well. The same connectedness that helps commerce and diplomacy also helps plague travel. This, too, is part of the truth. Integration has a dark side. The roads that carry silk can carry death. As decades pass, memory begins its own conquest. In some traditions, Genghis Khan becomes the embodiment of destruction. In others, a founder of order. In Mongolia itself, his image later acquired national and civilizational meaning far beyond medieval war. In global imagination, he is often flattened into caricature, either barbarian hurricane or strategic genius stripped of human cost. Neither reduction is enough, because when you look closely, Genghis Khan's empire was never invincible in the childish sense. It bled, it adapted, it depended, it learned from enemies, it used specialists from conquered peoples, it relied on fractured opponents, it required obedience so rigid that failure could be fatal. It moved through ecological limits, It was conditioned by succession politics. It could terrify the world and still be vulnerable to overextension, internal rivalry, and the simple fact that horses must eat. And maybe that is the most unsettling lesson of all. The Mongol Empire did not need supernatural strength to overturn the known world. It needed a leader capable of seeing war as structure rather than spectacle. It needed soldiers trained by the steppe to live with speed and hardship. It needed enemies divided enough to be defeated in detail. It needed terror calibrated so that one massacre might save 10 sieges. It needed tolerance where tolerance was useful, administrative pragmatism where administration was necessary, and myth wherever myth would travel ahead of the hoofbeats. That combination changed history. It changed the map, certainly. But more than that, it changed the imagination of power. After Genghis Khan, states across Eurasia had to reckon with the possibility that no wall was inherently high enough, no distance inherently safe enough, no old prestige inherently solid enough to survive a faster, harsher, more adaptive enemy. The Mongols taught settled empires to fear movement itself, but their legacy is not only fear, it is also a reminder that scale can be built quickly and then become almost impossible to hold together, that great systems often carry contradiction at their core, that the line between order and violence is thinner than empires like to admit. Genghis Khan unified tribes that had torn one another apart, then unleashed them on a continental stage. He created roads through carnage. He made exchange possible through annihilation. His empire reveals that power, at its highest intensity, is rarely pure. It is usually double-edged, brilliant, and brutal at once. So the truth about Genghis Khan's invincible empire is not that it was weak. Far from it. It was one of the most formidable political and military creations the world has ever seen. Nor is the truth that its legend is false. The legend exists because the achievement was real, because cities truly did fall in shock, because armies truly were outmaneuvered, because a man from the steppe truly did set in motion the largest contiguous land empire in history. The truth is harder and more human. It was not invincible. It was disciplined beyond mercy, adaptive beyond precedent, mobile beyond expectation, ruthless beyond consolation. It mastered the conditions of its age so completely that for a generation it looked like fate. But fate was never riding at the head of those columns. Men were. Men with bows, remounts, scouts, grudges, laws, ambitions, and limits. Men who made an empire so powerful that the world mistook its advantages for immortality. If you want more long-form history told with this kind of depth, subscribe and join me for the next story.